Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Amsterdam podcast, Chasing Impact. I'm joined today by Sam Worthington, who has served as the CEO of Interaction, the largest US-based alliance of international NGOs focused on people around the world. Hi, Sam. How are you?
Hi, and thanks for having the opportunity to join you.
It's a pleasure. Now, Sam, your tenure, your 2 decades at the top of the NGO, and your last decade at the steering the ship that is Interaction is coming to a close. You are preparing to do more time with your kids and your family, and it's an interesting time to have a conversation with you as you sit on and look back at 2 decades sitting at the bird eye view of NGOs and development in the world. And I'm really pleased for you to share your perspective with us here. Thank you for your time. Shall we dive right in? Wonderful. Now, first of all, for anybody listening, not deeply familiar with charities and non-governmental organizations, this is not a small bookseller shop down the road. This is a $17.5 million industry. This is major. And Sam has been, as I said, on the bird eye view here. Sam, let's start with the issues to look out for. Many people like their NGOs small, local, sort of amateurish, and by the people for the people. But you actually think differently about this. I know that you think that we need global entities who are capable of changing and building a better future. Large term, long term, well funded international non governmental organizations that to some look corporatized and hollowed out and professionalized. What would you say to these people?
I think local agency and the ownership of development at the local level is essential. And so too is a power shift, a shift towards the ability of individuals to have a say over shaping their own futures. But as we see in any global crises or any challenge, local needs to be supported. You can't deal with flows of refugees coming across borders simply locally. You can't deal with the climate crisis or issues of malnutrition simply locally. You need the capacity or capacity beyond local to reinforce those local abilities to impact human lives, to change possibilities for people's future. So the answer is you need both. And while we must focus on local, and that is our ideal, we can't stop on the local. If we do that, we become less powerful, less influential, and less able to help millions of people.
So you're basically saying the problems are too global, too large to stay local. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that, and that there is knowledge that is global. There's expertise. There are concepts. There are ideas that come from around the place. Some of the ideas that come around microfinance from Bangladesh are used in microfinance banks in the south side of Chicago. Issues that we've learned around child survival, of how people help children survive the first 5 years of life that came out of universities in the US, are now used around the world. So everywhere we have ideas, we have knowledge, we have expertise, and we need to think of ourselves not just as responding within our respective nation states. I reject the idea that there should be an America first or India first or Uganda first as the best model to advance human welfare or human rights. Yes, we need those local responses, but at the same time, we need to tie ourselves together around some common values of human welfare, around the Sustainable Development Goals, and around ideas of common good.
I think we all agree on that, Sam. I'm going to push this a little further and ask you a question. You're coming out here as in your support of local knowledge, local expertise, local aid, local development initiatives led by local people. At the same time, you're trying to spread and the validity of international, professional, global nonprofit organizations. How does that match up?
Well, it depends on the context. Some places the local needs to be dominant. If you were after Hurricane Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, local Philippine NGOs, government, and so forth were well equipped to respond, and you could support them from international actors. When you're in Darfur in the midst of a war and have to feed 2 million people a day, the local is torn apart in the civil war, and there was no local capacity to be able to handle 2 million people a day in that context. So the context matters, and it is somewhere always in between the two. It is tap the local as much as you can, but recognize that there are times when governments are overwhelmed, when local society is overwhelmed, or when it's torn in two. Yes, there's capacity within Ethiopia to respond to Tigray, but the reality is that you have a civil war going on, and the only ability to get to hundreds of thousands of people, should government allow them in, is through international capacity. And that capacity was built through the United Nations, but the UN in many ways is too cumbersome and too slow. So the world in the 20th century created a space for the evolution of the international nonprofit, of entities that we know as the Save the Children's or the World Visions or the Oxfams of this world. Those are the biggest ones, of course. There are many that are much smaller and more nimble and so forth. So that mixture of international capacity to provide large-scale lift when needed has to mirror what's happening in terms of local capacity. Where we go wrong is when the international overwhelms the local, and then there's something wrong. Where we also go wrong, if you say simply, we could take care of ourselves, usually if the situation is so bad or the situation or the problem is so large, you can't deal with it. We could not have responded to the global AIDS pandemic all locally. It required a global response, and the same thing is true in our response to the COVID.
Thanks, Sam. So you are basically saying that large INGOs need to be both. They need to be locally led in some places and global in others. I know you work with a lot of CEOs and leaders in the international non-government organizations. How do you manage an organization that needs to basically be a chameleon? How do you manage an organization that needs to prioritize and be led by local organizations in some context and insert global expertise in other contexts without effectively colonizing the aid efforts there?
I think that the challenge here is attention. So in areas where there is great local capacity, don't create international capacity on top of it. Reinforce it. We have member organizations that work entirely through local groups and through local nonprofits. And don't try to brand it as theirs or anything. They are there to support local capacity that exists. And we have situations where international nonprofits have gone global in a sense, where they have built capacity in country under their brand that is locally led, locally managed, local boards, and so forth. But the real challenge behind this is not the INGO or versus local. The real challenge here is the power of money and resources. Because there's lots of talk of going local and power shift, talking in our community, and it's something I embrace wholeheartedly and something we must do. But the resources that are coming from governments, ultimately, they are saying we are accountable to our parliaments or to our taxpayers.
Yes.
They are not making those resources more local, and they are not saying that those resources come with no strings or no limitations. So our tension is, how do you get as much local autonomy and agency over something, at the same time be responsive to donors who are insisting that you meet certain goals and certain deliverables that are associated with the resources they give. You will never have localization, purely locally owned and managed and so forth, unless it is totally funded by local resources. The moment you introduce international resources, you're going to get a tension between this desire for local agency and this desire for accountability from the funder. And NGOs find themselves caught between those two forces.
So Sam, are you saying if we are honest, if we as an NGO leader right now, if we're honest about localization, it won't work with international resources.
We have to look at what is the problem we're trying to solve. One of the problems is getting out of the way and making sure that local groups have a say over their own futures and their own societies and so forth. So that's one problem to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
But the other problem is that most resources don't flow through the NGO sector at all. In the US, we're maybe 10% of US government money, perhaps. Most flow through larger contractors, governments, and other entities. And those resources flow with various restrictions and norms associated with them. Part of challenging this is to look at that, change how governments give, change the requirements associated with foundation resources as those resources go out. Look at where are you trying to get accountability in a positive way and avoid corruption and so forth, and where you simply want more control over resources that makes no sense. So part of our role is to push back against our own governments, our own donors, and say we have a bias towards resources that are owned and shaped by local actors. We understand that you want an accountability. We understand that you don't want corruption. But if you have too much control over these resources, you negate and take away all the advantages that come from local actors having a say, doing what they can to help people's lives.
Okay, let's talk about that. That's I agree, and that's interesting. Let's talk about how we represent to our own governments, how the NGO sector and how the entire nonprofit sector. It's not just NGOs anymore. How they stay not led by the donors that often give them their money to the tune of at least 25% in the US. Now, I know that Interaction went to town on that. I think you have, in the not too distant past, won a case on the freedom arguing to the Supreme Court in the US that NGOs have a right to not be gagged effectively by the US government, even if they're funded by them under a larger freedom of speech argument. How did that feel, negotiating, steering Interaction as a representative of US civil society through that battle, right through to, up to and through the Supreme Court in the 21st century, when you kind of think that should be a given already? That must have been frustrating and exciting at the same time.
Well, we'd always assumed we had this freedom of speech, and the question was
Yes.
we had to prove it and prove it in a court of law. And we find that our relationship with government is twofold. On one level, we battle with and challenge. In another, we look where we can collaborate and move something forward together. In this case, we found that the US government was trying to make policies that impinged on our own voice. Yes, they could tell us what to do with their resources, because we could always say, we don't want your resources. But they can't tell us what to do with our own voice, our own political opinions, and so forth. And so we challenged that successfully all the way up to the Supreme Court, won a victory for NGOs in terms of clearly establishing our own independent voice respective of our government. And even if the government is funding us, we maintain that voice. At the same time, as we drill down into this, is what are the strings attached to those resources? We have for years worked with and challenged the procurement norms of the US government, how they control the resources, where can we push back and enable a partnership rather than a contractual relationship. This is an ongoing battle we have. We have seen, unfortunately, that as we have been more successful in establishing our voice, our independence, our ability to work, the governments have moved, and we've seen this in the US and in Europe, towards more contractor entities, simply entities that will do what they tell them to do. It's the difference between hiring someone to build 26 schools and you say, build 26 schools. Or I remember working at Plan International, and yes, we were building 26 schools, but we were doing it with local community groups, with school advisory groups. Some didn't want a school, so we did something else. They were built at different times. Everything was happening at a pace that was designed because of local. So in that sense, our challenge is to steer governments towards this ability to partner locally. My fear is, and I see this as a very, very positive move by the US government of let's move 30% of our resources directly, locally. That is great. But the US government is not the Swedish government. Those resources are going to come with so many strings, so many restrictions that they could harm and destroy a local civil society or simply turn them into entities that are an extension of the US government. It is essential that we find programs that do something different. And a model in my mind that comes to mind is the Ford Foundation. They have something called Build, where they've dedicated $1 billion simply to the capacity of local civil society. They're not telling them what to do, where to do it. They're saying, we invest in you for your ability to exist. Now, no government is going to do that. They will always want deliverables, but we need to head into that direction.
So let's talk about this a little bit, Sam. For the last 10 years, you've spent your time running a member organization that is ultimately in charge of manufacturing consent amongst a wide-ranging membership and then effectively projecting that as unified as voice as possible to the outside. How do you do that? Because you've had some successes on the Supreme Court, on the GA child nutrition case that resulted in hundreds of millions of efforts being put together towards child nutrition by the US and later, I think, the UK government. Great, well done. That does not come pain-free, right? As there are people on this podcast who are also representing membership organizations who also have the challenge of having to manufacture consent amongst them and then effectively project it. How do you do that?
So this is the expertise we've built. Well, that's now 38 years, and even before that, there were entities in the U.S. So we've been at this for a very long time. The one thing that we've learned, or several things we've learned, one is you have a common principle. In this case, it's human welfare, human dignity, human rights that everyone believes in. So you start off with this common principle. You also come with a pragmatism that our goal here is not to change each other. So if you come from a faith background that's more conservative or a progressive background, that doesn't matter. Allow people to come in from the different perspectives and how they exist, and that sort of level of mutual respect and tolerance has been built over decades. You then organize people and institutions around very concrete topics. At this point in time, Interaction has some 40 different work streams operating. So it's not as if we're trying to organize everyone and so forth, but let's get the groups that are focused on Ukraine, talking about Ukraine, those that are dealing with Yemen, having conversations on Yemen, those that are on food security there, and other groups around on climate or whatever the topic is. So organize in topical thematic areas, bring together the experts of those different groups so that they can come in and talk with them. And then the challenge then is present an external challenge. Are we simply here to talk with each other and have great big discussions? Or are we trying to actually solve something very concrete? So that the group has to have a set terms of reference of what it is trying to solve and why. And then what moves things along very rapidly is you're focused on particular policy makers, particular individuals. You don't have time for big, large papers. You do have time to pull together 1 or 2 pages together with 3 or 4 points that you agree on. And the discussion is not on all the issues you disagree about, but what are those 2 or 3 things that you can agree on? And get that in front of someone very rapidly at the highest level possible. And what we find is when that starts changing policies, when that starts changing laws, people begin to buy into this process as it works. I'll give a concrete example that's even larger scale than Interaction.
Right.
During the Millennium Development Goals, the torch for gender was going to be passed to the U.S., and it was a time there was a Bush administration, they didn't want anything to do with it. And we thought, well, why can't we accept this torch on behalf of civil society? And obviously, U.S. NGOs are just a small part. Let's bring together faith-based groups, and let's bring together movements like the National Organization of Women, and progressive groups around issues of gender. So the first room had some 60 organizations. Inevitably, people bring divisive topics and so forth. And the answer was no. If you want to debate what you disagree on, go do that elsewhere.
Yeah.
But what can you agree on? And so we ended up at the National Cathedral of 3,000 people in the room, and the pledges for $1.5 billion with evangelical Christian groups standing next to progressive advocate groups. And the one thing they were focusing on was the empowerment of girls. So it's focused on that common thing, see what you can to move it together. Sometimes it's easy because you have a common challenge you want to push against, anti-terror laws. Sometimes it's more aspirational. We want the government to invest in something, but get practical and pragmatic. And that's the infrastructure we have built over some 3 decades.
Interesting. So did that work out? It did? Well done. Well done. We've got about a few minutes left only, Sam. We are rapidly running out of time here, but there's a big topic that we absolutely must talk about, and that is looking into the future and maybe a couple of lessons from your past. Let's look into the future first. There are huge changes upcoming in the next 8 years alone, and certainly in the time after. We now live in a climate-changed environment. We're living through climate change. There's impact on that. There's other forces apart from the ongoing pandemic, the dissolution of international rule book, as we see in my neighborhood here in Europe right now, in the Ukraine. We see a pretty concerted assault, I'm going to call it, of business onto the traditional area where NGOs play and the market where NGOs thought this is what we have reserved here. And we see a lack of belief and credibility in many NGOs at the same time. That's just to name a few. What are the 3 things, if you had to limit it to 3, Sam, that NGO leaders and their senior management need to look out for over the next 8-10 years? And what would be your top tips for battling them? It's a huge question, but go ahead.
So the first is the world is fundamentally different than it was 2 years ago, let alone 10, 20 years ago, and will remain changing. Part of it is to remember that we have a role in this complex environment and to focus on where can you make a difference? Where pragmatically can you do something? Because we could always curse the darkness. To me, is the question of where can you light that match that actually does something concrete. So it's an issue of focus. It's very much looking at this as how adaptive are you as an organization? If someone is saying we're a large NGO and look how globally and all the good things we're doing today, if you have not and are not building an adaptive infrastructure, an infrastructure that could change, that could respond, that could spin off, that could merge, that could close efforts and so forth, that you are not able to change that institution, it will not survive. Our challenge is to be adaptive to the times. Also, within this very complex environment of pandemics, of rising conflict, of climate crisis, of poverty and human displacement, heading in the wrong direction, and so forth, we need to look at who are our allies in this mix. It's not us solving this problem. These are human problems. Where are there local governments that could work with? Where is the local capacity that we have? Are there new ways of connecting and relating to each other that we could do? Are there businesses that are positive to partner with and move us forward? Are there new forms of connectivity that we could take advantage, or social movements that we can engage in? So the world is changing rapidly, and our challenge is to sit back, to step back, to get some distance from this all, and to ask the question of where do we remain relevant? Stop those areas where we are not, reinforce those that we can. My fear is less that the INGO sector is going to disappear. If anything, more resources are flowing into larger institutions than ever before, and crises like the Ukraine just reinforce that trend. My fear is that we'll become less relevant and disconnected from the values that we are rooted in. So always asking ourselves, is this about the welfare of others? who has a voice over changing their future, and it must be people themselves. And how can we learn to partner in a way that is less hierarchical and less based on power and more based on the values that we advocate? That vision and that sense of purpose cannot go away from our sector. In fact, the world needs us more.
Why do you say that, Sam? Do you fear that NGOs are navel gazing? That they're too busy with the mechanics of running an international or a national civil organization and non-governmental organization, or are you fearing that they're moving away from their purpose somehow?
I think we always remain with our purpose. We do tend to auto critique and self critique ourselves all the time.
Yes.
And we also tend to see ourselves as the center of development. We are not. The center of development is not international development. It is local. It is happening through governments, through local institutions, through universities, through think tanks, through scientific effort, so forth. There's enormous amount of social change that is happening outside the NGO sector, which is far larger than anything we do. The question really for us, as we critique ourselves and try to do better, is always to focus on where do we make a difference. If something is displaced by a market and the market's taking care of it, let's focus on the people who are excluded from that market. If a war is displacing people, let's focus on the people who are displaced. If a disease results in vaccines that are inequitably applied, let's focus on issues of equity in vaccines. So our ability to adapt is linked inherently to our values. So I think we are good at those values. At times, I do think, however, that we spend too much time in a sense that somehow we are the center of things, rather than we are one contributor to this broad effort to advance human welfare, well-being, and rights around the world.
That's interesting. One follow-up question to that, Sam, and it relates to the first question. Are NGOs too self-centered? Are we, at the same time, if we are keeping our purpose and our values close to our heart, and let's bear in mind here that every organization under the sun professes to be purpose-led, are NGOs in danger of being too occupied with themselves, as a result, unable to change, unable to stay adaptive, unable to deliver impact?
I think one of the things that's there are various issues that are forcing us to change, whether we like it or not. In the U.S. context, you mentioned it's about $15.4 billion run through the NGOs that make up Interaction. And only about 24% of that is the entire U.S. government. So USAID is in the teens and so forth.
Yeah.
So we have multiple donors. We're not centered on government and dependent on government donors. You're having to get donations and engaging with the private sector. You're having to engage with other governments. You're having to engage with the UN. You're having to engage with local partners and individuals and so forth. And all those donors and all of them have influences on you and so forth. At the same time, you're operating in different environments. At times you're in war zones. Other times you're in areas where you're more playing a technical role in supporting a government on its health systems. So all these external forces are buffeting NGOs. They are changing what they're made up of. When we talk about them as if they're unitary, these are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of individuals around the world. They're made up of hundreds of different nationalities and technical skills and so forth. That infrastructure, I have found every time I dig and push into it, all the individuals are there because they believe in a set of values, a set of betterment of human beings and so forth. That, I think, is rooted in who we are. Our challenge is, how do we do that better? Can we do it in ways that give individuals more say over their own futures? What can we do when there's disinformation from nation states? What can we do when there's conflicts or attacks directed at the NGO sector itself? So one of our challenges is that we've grown up. We are no longer a sideshow of the world. We are, in essence, something that has a certain power, a certain influence, and all that comes with a massive amount of responsibility. And in that world, we have to ask ourselves, again, this constant question of how can we be more relevant, how can we be better, while remaining rooted in our values.
So, yes or no, Sam, I'm going to push you to that answer. Do NGOs need to professionalize more, run more smoothly, run more like a corporate in order to be more purpose-led, or do you feel that's not the case?
I don't see the contradiction. You want locally led small grassroots volunteer efforts, and we need those.
Yeah.
At the same time, you need the ability to get food and resources into Tigray in an efficient manner with very complex logistics.
Yeah.
The two are not at odds with each other, but
Okay.
don't have one crush the other. We do need to recognize that when you have a big footprint, you might step on others. And that is also a responsibility we have to make sure that when we partner, we do so in the best way possible. And I think we have a long way to go to be more effective partners around the world.
I agree. We do need to be far more effective partners around the world. Sam, second to last question. There are a plethora of NGOs, some of them members of your interaction membership body, many others who I would say fail to scale. They profess and they are deeply emotionally married to providing services and development support to their constituents, be that disabled people, be that people who are living out of poverty, be that children, girls' education, or be that anything. But for the last 10 years, by their own measures, they fail to expand the group of their impact, and many of them fail to serve more than 1% of their intended beneficiaries. You can sum this up as you fail to scale. It's hard to argue that you're an efficient, impactful organization if you do not touch the life of more than 1% of those who need your services. What would you say to these organizations?
I think of it, let's look at the NGO sector the way we look at business. You have multinationals, you have very targeted businesses that have niches,
Yeah.
and then you have startups that are doing new things and so forth. Okay, so that's the private sector. Move to the NGO sector, broader organized civil society. You have the multinationals, the big organized global NGOs with their broader scale. You have institutions that are niche, that technically move something forward. And then you have startups that are trying to solve. The reality is you start with what is it that we are accountable for and what are we relevant for? At the micro level, that little startup may help 10 people, or an NGO that is focused just on nutrition or just on issues of blindness or just on issues of burns. Pick your topic, that they may only help thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, but not millions of people. But that life that has been helped, that individual who you partner with who has a better future, that's what we're about. We cannot claim this ability to reach millions and so forth. Now, on the other end, you have the multinational NGOs, and they are trying and able to reach millions, but there's still millions more not reached. So the answer is yes, there is part of our sector that needs to scale and partner to scale through governments and others. But there are other parts of our sector that will bring expertise, that will help small populations, and there's still other parts of our community that are more focused as on a charity model. If I am going to help some individuals, some lives, I'm going to help save some lives in their future. All of them have relevance in terms of advancing human welfare. I think our challenge is less that we're too small or too big and so forth. At times we claim that we're going to change the world, and the answer is that's not true. We are able to change some lives. We are able at times to influence hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives. That is where we get relevant. Ultimately, helping one person gives us enough value to exist.
Great. I completely agree. And that's a really nice notion to answer that question as well. Sam, personal, last question. You are looking back at a long and distinguished career and quite a lot of impact, I might say, onto not just the US, but particularly the US civil society service. Thank you for that, first of all. Secondly, personal tips. There's a generational change happening. On from you personal, what would be your top 2 tips for any incoming leaders, or to manage a large INGO or a small INGO, be it from the diary, the managing the staff body, managing the donor and the foundation fundraiser expectations, or just the matter that you somehow need to be in 3 places all at the same time, all the time?
So tough question. I think the beginning of the answer is, of course, the new leadership, the changing generation coming in. We're going to end up with a more diverse, more inclusive, more representative leadership as a sector as a whole, and that's positive. Let's embrace that global vision. Let's embrace that diversity. I think it's critical, as both in terms of gender, ethnicity, backgrounds, and different orientations and so forth. So that's the first step. The second is there are some just general norms associated with leadership that I don't think will change too much. There has to be a degree of humility, a sense that you're leading from as a collective, you're leading through a mission and purpose. This is not the top-down leadership that you may get in the corporate sector. That does not work. It has to be earned. You have to be respected, and that respect has to come from your actions. And that's difficult to do in a community that is always challenging to do more. I do think it's important for anyone in these roles to look at their own sense of balance. If you are simply burning yourself out or not finding some sense of work-life balance or family-work balance, it is important that you look at this as a endeavor, and that is not this sort of I'm sacrificing myself and all my hours and so forth because I am changing the world in some positive way. Rather, you are contributing to positive change, but you have to do that from a sense of personal well-being and so forth. And lastly, I know there's been lots of talk about professionalizing and so forth, but there are all sorts of management, leadership norms, of adaptive leadership techniques to different forms of effective management that are professional, that are skills that need to be acquired and learned and so forth. So we're mirroring the best of what the private sector has and so forth, not because it's taking over it, but we're learning from those lessons with the values of the individuals coming from the nonprofit sector and the complexity of organizations. And remember that we are focused on delivering something that has an impact. And in doing so, that you can't solve everything. You need to delegate. You need to push it out to centers of leadership beyond yourself, that this is about a collective enterprise, not you, but that you have a role to play, perhaps as a conductor or others to make it
happen. A conductor, but ultimately responsible to make it happen. That's a good way of summarizing it. Sam, what are you going to do?
I have all sorts of plans in terms of some foundation boards, some engagement in mentoring and coaching of some of our member CEOs or others. I see myself doing a range of projects that asking various universities and roles. So I am going to keep myself very busy for some.
Fantastic. And I then do think that we will not see the last contribution of yours to the sector. Once again, thank you so much for that. It's been an interesting insight. There are 5,000 more topics we could talk about, but otherwise this podcast becomes a little bit long. As we dive into it in Washington next month, and if there's a particular topic, maybe we simply do another one. Conversation like this one. Sam Worthington from Interaction, thank you so much for joining us.